February 2017, two Airbus A340s take off from Athens, Greece. Flight plan filed for Kazakhstan. But as they cross into Iranian airspace, both jets disappear from radar. No mayday calls, no routing data, they simply vanished. What unfolds next reveals how Russian airlines plan to survive the sanctions. Picture this. You're boarding a flight in Moscow, settling into your seat on what appears to be a modern Airbus jet. The cabin looks clean, the screens work, everything seems normal. But what you don't see is the terrifying reality hidden beneath the surface. The crucial navigation system beside the pilot, smuggled into the country inside a passenger's suitcase. The engine powering your flight, cannibalized from another aircraft sitting in a distant hangar, stripped like a donor organ. The brake system? Well, one of them hasn't worked properly in months, but the airline decides to fly anyway. What I just described isn't dystopian fiction. It's the reality for millions of passengers flying Russian airlines right now. This is the story of the dangerous and sad state of Russian aviation. When Russia escalated its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the response from Western nations was swift and unprecedented. Within days, a cascade of sanctions began reshaping the global aviation landscape in ways that hadn't been seen since the Cold War. But these weren't just economic penalties on paper. They represented an existential threat to Russia's entire commercial aviation sector. The sanctions hit Russian aviation from multiple angles simultaneously. First came the airspace closures. European nations and North America shut their skies to Russian carriers, while Russia retaliated by closing its own airspace to Western airlines. For Russian carriers like Aeroflot, S7 and Ural Airlines, this meant the immediate loss of some of their most profitable routes. Flights to London, Paris, New York and Tokyo, routes that had symbolized Russia's integration into the global aviation network, vanished overnight. But the airspace restrictions were only the beginning. The real devastation came from the supply chain disruptions. Boeing and Airbus immediately halted all parts deliveries, technical support, and maintenance services to Russian carriers. This created an unprecedented crisis because, in a matter of weeks, Russia's aviation industry was essentially isolated from the global system that had sustained it for decades. Consider the scale of the problem. Russia's commercial aviation fleet consisted of approximately 1,100 passenger aircraft. Of these, roughly 67% were foreign-made planes, predominantly Boeing and Airbus jets. Even more critically, about two-thirds of these aircraft weren't even owned by Russian airlines. Instead, they were leased from companies based outside Russia, primarily in Ireland and the United States. This meant that when sanctions hit, Russian airlines weren't just cut off from parts and support. They were technically flying aircraft they didn't own and couldn't legally keep. Russian authorities faced a stark question: surrender these valuable assets and cripple their aviation industry, or find another way forward. So, in March 2022, the Russian government made a decision that would reverberate through international courts for years to come. It passed an emergency ordinance that effectively told Russian carriers to retain possession of all leased aircraft currently in its territory and re-register them under Russian jurisdiction. In plain terms, Russia was instructing its airlines to steal the planes. The scale of this appropriation was staggering. Over 500 Western-built aircraft, collectively worth more than $10 billion, were suddenly trapped behind a geopolitical iron curtain. For the leasing companies who owned these planes, this represented the largest theft in aviation history. The response came in the form of what would become one of the most complex legal battles ever seen in the aviation industry. In June of last year, a remarkable scene unfolded in Ireland. The Irish court system had to establish a temporary makeshift courtroom because they were facing the largest legal case in the country's history, not in terms of money involved, though that was substantial, but in terms of the sheer number of lawyers required to argue it, over 180 of them. The stakes? Approximately 2.5 billion euros, and that covered only about 80 of the 500-plus aircraft seized by Russia. But here's where the story takes another troubling turn. Despite these legal measures, the leasing companies found themselves caught in a bureaucratic and legal maze. The insurers, who were supposed to compensate the lessors for their lost aircraft, argued that there hadn't actually been a physical loss of the aircraft. Their reasoning? The planes still technically exist and could potentially be repossessed in the future. Some insurers even argued that the lessors themselves had triggered the loss by terminating the lease agreements in response to the sanctions. This legal standoff continues today, with similar cases proceeding in the United Kingdom and the United States. Meanwhile, several lessors, exhausted by the legal quagmire, have opted to settle directly with Russian insurers, effectively selling their aircraft to the Russian carriers at massive discounts. But even with these settlements, over half of the originally seized aircraft remain in legal limbo, technically stolen, practically irretrievable. Russian authorities saw this as their victory. They claimed that their aviation sector was operating normally, as it did in the pre-war era, essentially beating the West at its own game. But when you dig deeper into what's actually happening, things get scary. I mean, really scary. You see, seizing the aircraft was only the first step, but the real challenge facing Russian airlines is how to keep these planes airworthy without access to the global supply chain that sustains modern aviation. And the solutions they've found are as desperate as they are dangerous. Before the war, Russian carriers like Aeroflot operated like any major international airline. They relied on a sophisticated network of maintenance and repair facilities, primarily in Germany and Hong Kong, to service their Western-built aircraft. These facilities had direct access to Boeing and Airbus parts, official technical documentation, and certified repair procedures. When a component needed replacement, it arrived within days with full traceability and certification. That system collapsed overnight. Airbus and Boeing ceased all cooperation with Russian carriers. But here's what made the situation even more desperate. Even China, which hasn't imposed direct sanctions on Russia, instructed its maintenance centers to stop servicing Russian aircraft. Why? Because Chinese leadership feared secondary sanctions would cost them their access to Boeing and Airbus parts, essentially crippling their own aviation sector. So losing Russian business was a small price to pay compared to losing their entire international connectivity. This left Russian airlines in an impossible situation. Modern aircraft require continuous maintenance, with thousands of components needing replacement at specific intervals. Without access to these parts, the only option was cannibalization, dismantling some aircraft to keep others flying. Before the war, Aeroflot was flying brand new Airbus A340s to destinations like New York and Tokyo, a symbol of Russia's return to global aviation prestige. Today, that fleet has contracted to fewer than 180 active aircraft. Approximately 15% of its jets sit parked, or are being systematically stripped for spare parts. Inside maintenance hangars on the edges of Moscow and other Russian cities, a grim routine has become standard practice. Mechanics have started calling it organ donation. Newer jets are gutted so that older ones can continue flying. In one bay, an A350's panels hang open, its cables carefully tagged for salvage. Every usable component, hydraulic actuators, avionics boxes, sensors, even seats and galley equipment, finds a new home in another aircraft. The desperation of this situation became evident in cases that would be unthinkable for any Western carrier. There were confirmed reports that Aeroflot operated several aircraft with one inoperative brake system for extended periods while waiting for replacement parts to arrive. Think about that for a moment. Commercial airliners carrying hundreds of passengers, flying with degraded braking capability, because the airline simply couldn't source the necessary components. As a result, the airline has been forced to return to older Soviet-era aircraft types, especially the Tupolev Tu-14s, Antonov turboprops, and remarkably, the Ilyushin 96, a four-engine behemoth that burns 40% more fuel than modern twin-engine jets. But Russian airlines didn't just resign themselves to cannibalization. They began developing an elaborate shadow supply chain, and this is where the story becomes truly alarming from a safety perspective. Enter companies like Turboshaft FZE, a UAE-based firm with a curious history. Originally, Turboshaft specialized in selling used parts from old Soviet aircraft to buyers around the world. But when Western sanctions cut off Russian aviation from legitimate supply chains, companies like Turboshaft saw an opportunity. They reversed their business model. Instead of selling Russian parts to the world, they would smuggle Western parts to Russia. The methods are as creative as they are concerning. Take the case that was revealed through customs documents at Moscow's Vnukovo airport. In July 2022, Russia's S7 Airlines received shipments of air data inertial reference units, critical navigation systems, packed inside passenger luggage. 11 units in total, each weighing 11 kilograms. These aren't minor components, these are sophisticated systems that feed crucial flight data to the aircraft's autopilot and navigation systems. This isn't an isolated incident. A complex network of relatively small companies, many based in the United Arab Emirates, but also operating from China, the Maldives, and Turkey, have emerged to serve this black market. They repackage vital aircraft components and ship them through circuitous routes, often with falsified documentation about their origin and destination. But here's the terrifying part about this shadow supply chain. When you're dealing with parts from these sources, you have absolutely no certainty about what you're actually getting. Some of these components might be genuine Boeing or Airbus parts diverted from legitimate channels, but most of them are used and counterfeit parts. And perhaps most dangerously, they could be genuine parts that have already exceeded their certified service life. You see, in the legitimate aviation world, there's a sophisticated tracking system for every critical component. Parts have serial numbers, maintenance histories, and certified life limits. When a component reaches its flight hour limit or calendar limit, it must be removed from service and either overhauled by a certified facility or scrapped. But when parts arrive repackaged in suitcases with documentation that may have been fabricated, how can anyone verify their true history? In fact, when Turboshaft was selling used Soviet aircraft components years ago, some customers complained about the quality of what they received. Now, Russian airlines are betting passenger lives on similar sources for their Western aircraft. And it's not like they're cheap. These smuggled parts cost Russian airlines dearly, though perhaps not as much as it's costing passenger safety. The markup on black market aviation parts is extraordinary. Russian airlines are reportedly paying almost $100,000 for each of those suitcase smuggled navigation equipment, double the normal price of $50,000 to $70,000. In response, the Russian government has set aside about $2.7 billion to help its airlines with sanction-related expenses. But even with state support, Russian carriers are operating with only a fraction of the spare parts they actually need. The true depth of this crisis became visible in an incident that seemed almost surreal. In September 2023, a Ural Airlines Airbus A340 made an emergency landing in a muddy field in Siberia after experiencing technical problems. The aircraft, carrying over 150 passengers, came down in a remote area near the Kazakh border. Now, in normal circumstances, when an aircraft makes an emergency landing in a muddy field, it is dismantled and transported by road to a facility for assessment. But Ural Airlines seriously considered attempting to fly the aircraft out of that field. They waited through the winter, hoping the ground would freeze solid enough to support a takeoff. Engineers evaluated whether they could create a temporary runway in this remote location. In the end, the plan was abandoned, not because it was recognized as extraordinarily risky, but because the field simply didn't freeze hard enough during the winter to support the aircraft's weight. The fact that a Russian airline seriously contemplated this operation speaks volumes about their desperation. Such a plan would never have been considered if parts were available through legal channels, but in Russia's current aviation reality, every aircraft is too valuable to abandon. Facing these mounting challenges, Russian aviation officials began looking for solutions from other countries operating under similar constraints, and they found a potential model in Iran. Iran has been under comprehensive international sanctions for decades, yet it has managed to maintain its aviation sector, although at a significantly compromised safety level. In April 2023, Aeroflot sent one of its Airbus A340s to Tehran for maintenance, where the Iranian carrier Mahan Air operates a maintenance facility. This was a test case. Aeroflot wanted to determine whether Iran could be trusted for the maintenance of its fleet, but the results were so bad that even Aeroflot wasn't satisfied with the quality of work performed. So you might wonder, how on earth is Russia dealing with the aircraft and parts shortage, especially after cannibalizing planes for spare parts? Well, the answer isn't just shocking, it sounds like a plot straight out of a fiction novel. You see, when Aeroflot sent its plane to Iran, the Iranian example offered something more valuable than just maintenance services, a blueprint for survival under sanctions. Iran's approach involved a vast network of shady companies to acquire aircraft that would otherwise be inaccessible due to sanctions, through misrepresentation and manipulation of international laws. In 2016, something strange happened. UAE-based Turboshaft, the same company we talked about earlier, purchased two old Airbus A340s from the Greek government. These aircraft had previously served Olympic Airways, but had been parked at Athens airport, essentially abandoned after the company ceased operations in 2009. The Greek government sold them to Turboshaft as salvage, as the aircraft had reached the end of their useful life. But Turboshaft had other plans. Somehow, the company managed to make these aircraft airworthy with the intention of selling them to Kazakhstan's Bek Air. As a result, in February 2017, both jets took off from Athens, with flight plans filed for a flight to Kazakhstan. But here's where the story takes its dramatic turn. The planes that were supposed to reach Kazakhstan never did. As the planes flew over Iranian airspace, they disappeared from all radars without a trace. No mayday calls, no routing data, nothing. But soon, it was revealed that both planes had taken a detour over Iran and landed in Tehran to serve Iran's Mahan Air, one of which continues to fly for the airline to this day. This wasn't a one-time operation. Iran acquired 4 additional Airbus A340s through remarkably similar circumstances. Former Turkish Airlines aircraft that were being ferried from South Africa to Uzbekistan ended up in Tehran. And in February 2024, 2 more A340s arrived from Lithuania. Each time, the pattern was similar: aircraft purchased ostensibly for one purpose, then diverted to Iran mid-flight. Now, similar stories are emerging from Russia. Recently, a brand new Airbus A320neo, originally purchased before the 2022 sanctions as a private jet, somehow made its way into Russia after its registration changed multiple times through different jurisdictions. The aircraft appeared to hopscotch through various countries, each time changing its registration, until it finally landed in Russian territory. According to Russia's own Verstka media, Russia has smuggled over 28 foreign-made aircraft in 2024 alone, ranging from small private planes to large passenger airliners. While these workarounds provide temporary relief, Russia has announced ambitious plans to revive domestic aircraft manufacturing. The stated goal is to reduce dependence on Western aircraft by ramping up production of Russian-made jets, the MC-21, the Sukhoi Superjet, and the Tupolev Tu-214. On paper, this would mean replacing the Western aircraft that Russian carriers are cannibalizing. In reality, production lines remain choked by the same sanctions that grounded the Boeings and Airbuses they were meant to replace. The MC-21, which was supposed to be Russia's answer to the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320, faced a critical setback when sanctions cut off access to its Pratt & Whitney engines. Russia was forced to switch to a domestically produced alternative, the Aviadvigatel PD-14 engine. But this replacement has proven far less reliable than the Western engines it replaced, requiring substantially more maintenance and suffering from various technical problems. The situation became critical when Russia's Kommersant newspaper revealed that Aviadvigatel was reducing engine production to merely 7 units per year due to various production problems. Think about that, 7 engines per year. Aeroflot alone has an order for 100 MC-21 aircraft at 7 engines per year. And with each aircraft needing 2 engines, it would take decades just to fulfill Aeroflot's first order. And that's assuming every engine works perfectly and never needs replacement. The Sukhoi Superjet faces similar challenges. Its engines were made in a joint venture with France's Safran, and sanctions have cut off that supply chain. Reports indicate that Russian operators are now reusing filters that should be replaced when clogged. They're cleaning and reinstalling them. If these are fuel filters, the implications for engine reliability and safety are deeply concerning. What we're witnessing is not the adaptation of Russian aviation to a new reality. It's the slow-motion degradation of an entire industry's safety culture. Modern commercial aviation achieved its remarkable safety record through standardization and rigorous adherence to maintenance protocols, and Russia is now operating in direct contradiction to these principles. The aircraft that passengers board in Russia today may look safe from the outside, But beneath that veneer lies a system held together by smuggled parts, cannibalized components, and increasingly desperate shortcuts. While Russian authorities claim normalcy, the evidence suggests an industry operating on borrowed time, with each flight representing a gamble that all the improvised solutions will continue to hold together. The question is no longer whether Russian aviation can return to its pre-war status. That ship has sailed, quite literally. The question now is how long the current system can be sustained before the inevitable consequences occur. And when they do, the disaster will be measured not in lost aircraft or insurance claims, but in human lives.